think just to kind of have consistency throughout the discussion, we should have some definitions knocked out right away. We may not even have a consistent definition between the two of us, but I think... Hey, hello, Moongoon. Welcome. I'm not sure who you are, but hello. Thanks for chatting with us. If you have any questions, feel free to say hello. Feel free to ask away. But let's go ahead and... Oh, it's Jeremy. Hi, Jeremy. Nice to have you on, buddy.
Ward?
Yeah, I guess so. Been a while. Been a long, long time.
What's going on, bro?
Welcome to the chat, man. Feel free to jump in and ask questions, or if you'd like to jump in and give us a call when we get to that section, we'd be more than happy to have you on. But let's go ahead and discuss the definition of morality. Nice. Thanks, Jeremy. Let's go ahead and discuss the definition of morality first, because I think a lot of times there's a little bit of confusion between things like morality and ethics. So in the very, very basics definition of morality, we're essentially talking about what is right versus what is wrong, which is kind of what I have in the background here. Whereas ethics is more, I would say it's more of like a standard of rules kind of in place by a government or business. For instance, if you work at a company, they may have ethical statements that you can and cannot do. So, for instance, you may not be able to take more than 2 15-minute breaks during a certain length of shift. That's their ethical viewpoint. That has nothing to do with morality. So, let's go ahead and get that cleared up right away. And then as far as subjectivity, objectivity, I think we can just talk about those two. The origins doesn't really need defining. And then we may even, when we get to the main page, have to define a few more terms, but we'll get to that as necessary. So subjectivity, when it comes to morality, I'll take on that one. Gio, if you don't mind just taking objectivity. So subjectivity, as far as morality goes, in short, is everyone has their own viewpoint. Therefore, there is nothing set in stone as to what is right and what is wrong. So since everyone has their own viewpoint and everyone has their own opinion on it, there is no one single defining or tying or binding characteristic to line up morality all in a neat row, if you will. So that's what subjectivity is. Whereas you have one viewpoint over here, a different viewpoint over here. Since you don't have the same, it is subjective. And then, Gio, the obvious opposite of that, you can go ahead and tackle objectivity.
Yeah, when I say objectivity, what I mean is mind independent, right? So it is not subject to opinion. Kind of like if I was to tell 10 people, I say, here are buckets, I want you to put 10 pounds of sand in them. As long as they follow my instructions, I'm going to get the same thing from all 10 people. If I were to say, put a good amount of sand in the bucket, I might come back with 10 various weighing pounds of sand. So that's how I would distinguish subjectivity and objectivity. So for me, objective is mind independent. It is not subject to one's opinion.
Okay, fair enough. We may get a little more into your definition of mind independent on the main contested points page here in just a second, because obviously we talk about realism versus anti-realism and like non-objectivity, which would say is closer to your mind independent than subjectivity, in my opinion. But we'll discuss that when time comes. Nonetheless, let's go ahead and switch over to the contested points page. We're going to bring up our call-in number. If you'd like to call in, that is going to be an option that we're going to have open. I have it up on my screen here. Hopefully all the audio is getting diverted. In the meantime, we'll go ahead and start tackling this, and
Yes,
I think Panda's going to jump in as well.
202-888-5350.
That's the number. If you missed it, it's right there at the top in bright red. Try to make it as easy as possible. It's also on our starting soon page. It is active all the time, but we only will be answering it during the time of the stream, obviously. That way we can just kind of keep an eye on it there. With that in mind, let's go ahead and take on subjectivity versus objectivity, because this is like the biggest contested point in morality probably of all time. It's been going on for as long as anyone can remember.
Yeah, I think the reason why this topic is so scary for people is that if without objective morality, you have no way to say that something was definitely wrong. One of the examples that people quickly go to is this: they'll say that the Holocaust, without objective morals, what was wrong with the Holocaust? It was what Hitler did was just a matter of opinion, and people become afraid of conversations like that. They're once you go into once you get away from the idea that there's not some morality that's intrinsic to the universe, things become complicated.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. So, and I'll kind of expand upon that a little bit, and by what you mean, at least I'll try to, by what you're saying as far as intrinsic value is that something holds a value beyond what its physical materials might lie. So, for instance, you might say gold is only useful in the sense of it is a really good conductor of electricity, so it's used in a lot of electronics. So it has a value because it performs these functions for society currently. Whereas things that are much less valuable may just include, like, well, there's a lot of things that we use very well, but for instance, we'll talk about like antimatter. There's very little of it that we even know of, and right now we don't have good uses for it. We're not using it in almost everything that we use every day. Whereas things like wood and metal and paper and that kind of stuff, we're using quite frequently. Not saying that there won't be any good uses for antimatter in the future, but as of right now, just kind of as an example, and that is typically referred to as nousomatic value. So there's value because it provides something for us as a society, whereas intrinsically it's worth nothing to itself because it's just a piece of metal, just like all other metal, just like all other wood, just like all other materials. It's just a material, and the entire universe is consisted of materials. So
yeah, I'd argue intrinsic value doesn't even exist. But yeah, we can talk about that later.
Yeah, so we definitely would want to talk on that as far as, like, I think that would definitely fall under, like, realism versus anti-realism. It could also delve into, like, the ramifications of what having intrinsic value means. And I think ramifications of it all, which is something that it's just going to tie into pretty much every question we have or every debatable topic here. So with that in mind, just right off the bat, subjectivity or objectivity, and why?
You mean for morality?
Yep.
So for me, it's a mixture of both. So the way I define morality is, I was looking at a Google definition. Google the definition of morality, and pull it back up again. And it said principles concerning the distinction between right and wrong or good and bad behavior. And so I want to zone in on that word behavior. For me, morality is what a person ought to do, essentially. And when we get into the oughts, it doesn't make sense to have an ought without describing some sort of goal. Right? So, like, if I were to say, you ought to run as fast as you can, that statement without any context, it's uninformative. It doesn't even make any sense. So what's the goal? If the goal is to win 100 meter and running as fast as you can, which should be, is good advice. If you're running a marathon and running as fast as you can is a sure way to lose. So for me, you can have objective ways to reach a goal. There are objectively good and bad ways to reach the goal. Back to the example of running that the 100 meter sprint versus the marathon. But there's no intrinsic reason why you should care about running a 100 meter or why you should care about winning a marathon instead. So the goal is subjective. However, the once you've decided what the goal is, there are objectively good and bad ways to achieve that goal.
So
That's how.
just to clarify there, I would say you're discussing a little bit of the is ought, which was often discussed by like David Hume. Whereas if you have an is, then it kind of gets you to the ought. If your goal is to become a doctor, then you ought to go to med school. If your goal is to run a 100-meter dash as fast as possible, then you ought to run as quickly as you can. Whereas if your goal is to run a marathon, then you ought to run in a manner in which you can maintain the distance necessary to get to the end of the marathon.
Exactly. These are his hypothetical and categorical imperatives.
Yeah, and one would say, like, obviously the hypothetical is if the is there versus the ought.
Mm-hmm.
So the is of whatever it is that you're trying to do gives you this ought that you should do. Now, would you say that morality has a categorical imperative?
No.
No. Well, so morality wouldn't say there's anything that you ought to do.
Well, it does, but moral goals aren't objective. There is not a category imperative relative to moral goals, but moral evaluations you can make objective measurements on those. So let's say, like, back to the example running 100 meter, right? So I say you ought to run as fast as you can. What if you don't care about winning? There's no intrinsic reason why you ought to care about winning the race. And if you don't, then maybe you have no interest. Maybe you shouldn't run as fast as you can.
Right. Therefore, you might risk injury, or there are other things that you could risk potentially if you have like heart conditions, stuff like that. You may not want to run as fast as possible. Whereas if your goal is strictly to win your 100-meter race, you probably want to run as fast as possible.
Sure. And my moral goal is roughly defined as human well-being. I address very similar approach. I come at a very similar approach that Sam Harris comes with it. I think he takes a little too far in his moral landscape because he thinks the moral goal itself can be objective, and I disagree with that. But I think it can be. I think you can roughly define. Well, what I call morality is roughly defined as well-being, and to zone in on it a little more, I'd say I'm concerned about wealth, health, and happiness. And when I say wealth, I'm not talking about being rich. I'm talking about being able to have access to resources: food, medicine, clothing, shelter, etc.
Basic needs: food, water, and shelter.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, I would obviously be a little hesitant to say I agree with Sam Harris as far as he takes some of his moral landscape, because I think you and I both know that he takes it into the realm of saying that science is capable of understanding and expressing what
The goals.
essentially the goals.
Yeah, he says science can express the goals, and I don't see how it can do that. Once you've defined the goal, science can tell you whether or not your actions are conducive to achieving that goal, but they can't define the goal itself.
Right, and so your mixture here, you're kind of balancing between subjectivity and objectivity is that your objectivity is a goal that you clearly define, even though that goal in and of itself isn't objective to everyone. If you have a subset of people who agree upon that goal, then you can make progress towards that goal. Is that what I'm getting from it?
Exactly. I mean, essentially, you're making objective assessments of a subjective goal. Essentially.
Yeah. So, with that in mind, in and of itself, so we kind of have to talk about the epistemology of morality. And so, I think you've kind of taken a standpoint here of like morality itself can be defined subjectively and objectively. By having a goal that is objective, then it is in and of itself objective. Whereas there may be a number of ways to obtain that goal.
I wouldn't say it's defined objectively. I'd say it's defined subjectively. But once it is defined, you can make objective measurements about it. Because, like for instance, back to the 100-meter, right? Your goal may not be to win. Maybe your goal is to attract attention to yourself, in some sort of way, right? And so maybe instead of winning, you run crazy across the finish line or something like that, So there's no intrinsic reason, there's no objective reason to care about winning in a 100-meter race. That's kind of what I'm saying. So if you do care about it, objectively, there are good and bad ways to win if you care about winning.
Kind of lending credence back to the is ought proposition, where if your goal is something, then you ought to do something else.
Exactly.
All right, fair enough. I think we can kind of delve deep into this, which is where I say that morality is a wellspring in which we can jump in. I see Panda jumped on our Discord channel. I don't know if he's going to jump into the chat yet, but I told him he could jump in whenever, so if he kind of interrupts us, we apologize to the viewers, but I think it'll be nice to have somebody else on. So let's talk a little bit about the epistemology of morality. In and of itself, do you think that there, as far as right and wrong and how right and wrong goes, do you think in any way, shape, or form there is a definitive right and wrong?
For some things, it may be the case. You may have, think about like a scenario, whereas let's say we were talking about this a few weeks ago on the phone. We were talking about I'm hiding in your house and there's a Nazi or something is coming to kill me or something. And do you lie to him? So there's so many ways that could play out. Right. And it'd be very hard to narrow in on one objectively best way to handle that. Like, do you lie or do you do some other form of deception? Do you change the subject? Do you fight on it? So it may be hard to narrow in on the best. There are good and bad ways to go about it, but choosing a best, I'm not sure if it exists, and even if if there was one. I'm not sure if we'd have the ability to find out, but there may be some other uh, moral situations you find yourself in, and it's really only two ways to go about it. And if it can, you can narrow your moral decisions down to those two, then I'd say yes, definitely. In that situation, you could is a best way to go about this.
So yeah, I was gonna basically ask you to clarify whether you thought there was indeed a best inherently or intrinsically best answer to the problem of morality or not, and you
Sure.
almost
How
juked
about
the question there.
Let's say here's this fabulous scenario. There are, and that's my oh, so here's a fabulous scenario. There there are two buttons you can press, right? One button is going to feed all the starving children. The other is going to torture them, right? Those are your only two options.
Mm-hmm.
You have to press a button.
Okay.
If for some reason you don't choose to press a button, there's just there's something I got mind control, and I'm going to force you to pick a random button. Right.
Okay.
So you have two choices before you.
Yeah.
Right. Now, because your moral decision is so limited, you could definitely say there is a best answer. The best answer is to pick to choose the button that's going to feed the children, not starve them.
Well, just to play devil's advocate here, what's to say that that's the best answer? I mean,
torturing the children.
Well, that feeding the children, the hungry children, would be the best answer, because what's to say that starving children in and of itself is wrong? Like, so,
well,
that's where like morality versus like taking a step back to like things that are naturally happening kind of diverge, in my opinion. Whereas if you said you have to press a button and you're either going to actively kill someone or give them a lollipop, like you're having two actions here that have to be played out. Whereas if you made me choose randomly between letting children starve to death or letting them be tortured or giving them all food, like these are things that are like kind of passive in their actions, if you will. They don't really make me do anything. Like, if it's not me pulling the trigger, it's not me, starving the children to begin with. It's not my money that's feeding the children. It's really kind of not impacting me in any way. To the extent of, if you're trying to argue for moral subjectivity, there's really no moral object or objective way or reason that I should feed these children.
Well, yeah. I mean, I guess I made the assumption that the person behind the button is a secular humanist. Well, I said you were, and so.
Well, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I agree. There's no objective reason to care about feeding starving children. However, if you care about human flourishing, it is objectively better to press the button.
Well, that's where this gets into like a really fun conversation, because the real question is, in my opinion, why? Why should you care about like starving children? If there is no moral objectivity, to play devil's advocate here, even though we both know where each other stand on the matter, if there is no moral objectivity, why should I care about starving children?
Well, I mean, I think it starts from a selfish point of view. Honestly, I think that's the way it starts with everyone. And like for instance, and when I say selfish, I mean not as in the connotation that it has. I mean, just from a egocentric point of view. I don't like suffering. I don't like starving. I don't like being harmed. So the world that I want to create is one where that's less likely to happen to me. And typically, if I show kindness to people and feed starving children or etc., they're more likely to reciprocate. And also the world that I'm creating, that I'm living in. I don't I don't want these things to happen to me, so I ought to care about them happening to other people. The more that I reduce hunger, the less likely I am to go hungry.
So I can't say that that's necessarily true, because there's no the kind of strange thing about humanity, at least, is that there's no guarantee of kindness. And what I mean by that is that even though for thousands and thousands of years, even though some people refer to it as the golden rule or the eye for an eye or the do unto others, however you want to call it, it existed thousands of years before, like 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. We saw this in the Code of Hammurabi.
Yeah.
Right. So like when humans first were working on writing, at least the earliest writing that we've ever discovered, we kind of had this, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. The problem is humans don't always, and they don't necessarily abide by these rules. So just because you're feeding other people doesn't give any credence to you not going hungry.
Yeah, and so of course it doesn't guarantee. Man, I don't think you could necessarily guarantee anything. What I mean is it's a general rule. It's usually the case when I'm kind to people, they reciprocate. Like I walked in this morning, somebody sent the wrong package to my door, and I took it over to the leasing office because it was the right address, but I mean it was the right address, but wrong name. And so when I walked in, I smiled at the lady. She smiled back. Right. So but there's no guarantee. Maybe she was in a sour mood, or maybe she doesn't like bald people or something like that. Right. And so she could give me an angry face for whatever reason. So there's no guarantee, but typically people reciprocate. If the nicer you are to people, more likely they are to be nice to you.
So would you say that you scratch my back, I scratch yours is a good standpoint when considering morality? Because it seems like if we're going to go to like moral subjectivity, then
generally I'd say yes.
Yeah. So what do you do in cases of people with addictions, or I'll use this term even though I don't really care to use it, the term kink, I'll use the more scientific term of like sadism and masochism, where people enjoy pain or enjoy things that you definitely don't enjoy, but in order to provide for themselves this level of pleasure, that's what it takes. Whereas if they did that to you, you wouldn't enjoy it.
Yeah, so let's step back for a second. So let's see. Yes, that happens. It's pretty rare. But let's say I'm dealing with a sadist, right, who gets pleasure from pain. I mean, the point is that the more likely that I am to show respect and kindness to him, and maybe to him, kindness would be in a form of being whipped on the back or something like that, right? Okay, sure. And if the more likely that I'm to do what he perceives as kindness, more likely he is to do what I perceive as kindness to me.
Gotcha. So what you're saying is it doesn't matter the actual action or the actual reciprocity. It matters that like that person perceives it as respect and or pleasure, and therefore is more likely to provide you with respect and or pleasure.
Exactly.
I see what you're saying. So I think we'll kind of circle back to where we started this and why people are afraid of moral subjectivity. And I think you kind of started out with like, oh, why is the Holocaust wrong? Why is this wrong? Why is that wrong? If moral subjectivity is the standard or is the reality of the universe in which we live, then things like the Holocaust being subjectively wrong sounds really, really wrong to say.
Yeah.
So how do we kind of like compensate for that? Like how does a person who claims to be a good, moral, upright person say that in and of itself the Holocaust is not objectively wrong?
I would say I would argue that the Holocaust is objectively wrong relative to the goal of well-being.
But what if not everyone has that goal? Because, for instance, obviously Hitler and his cronies didn't have the goal of human well-being, or they may have, but they had a really different viewpoint of well-being than you did.
I mean, Hitler is definitely not a secular humanist. So, I mean, in that regard, I'd say that he was wrong. So, obviously, Hitler didn't care about all human flourishing. He cared about the Germans, even at the expense of everyone else. But generally, people do care about their well-being. People who don't care about their well-being tend to out themselves. You know, imagine you don't care whether you live or die. You don't care about your own health and your happiness. You're probably not going to be on Earth very long. So typically, if you're alive to have the conversation, you do care about your well-being. Since you do, since you have subjectively decided to care about your well-being, hey, let's talk about this moral, this action and whether or not it lined up to your subjective goal of well-being. And so in that regard, we can look at something like the Holocaust, we can look at slavery, etc., and say this was objectively wrong, making the assumption that they care about the well-being. And even I was talking to some Christians online, and they disagreed with me on the well-being part. They said that morality is based in God. And what I thought was interesting was that I asked them, I was like, why should I care about what God thinks? And then they told me, well, God can punish you in hell, right? And I was like, well, why should I care about that? And their answer was pretty much that it's in my best interest, that it is in my best well-being to not be in hell. So even the people who try to ostensibly base their in a God, they're still appealing to well-being.
Gotcha. And so kind of snowballing and rolling with that, that kind of delves into a little bit about morality's origin. And it sounds like, obviously, with some of the people that you've discussed and Christians and whatnot that you've discussed it with, and people I've had discussions with before as well, that hold to some form of deity or another, typically would say that morality, the origin of morality is their deity. Whereas I think you and I both have different viewpoints on the origin of morality and where it would come from without a deity. So I'll ask you two questions and let you answer them. at your leisure. But the first question being, does morality come, if it doesn't come from a deity, what is its origin? And then the second question being, like, without such a deity or without this in place, is there any reason to have a consistent viewpoint on morality?
Sure. So I look at, I think the origin of morality, I think it evolved with just about every other characteristic that humans have. And I think it was naturally selected for. People, like I was saying earlier, people who don't care about their well-being won't live long enough to reproduce, right? You're not gonna survive. And people who don't survive don't get to spread their seed and create more people who don't care about their well-being. Like I said, they tend to off themselves. So what does that do? That leaves only people who care about their well-being.
And just to clarify, because you've used the term now at least twice before, I believe now. But when you say people mean to off themselves, you're not. I don't think you're using it in the slang term of things such as suicide. You're meaning over generations, if you're not prone to procreate, then you're going to die off. Just kind of like the form of natural selection, not in the sense of everyone that has, these thoughts or these ideals commit suicide, more that these people that have these thoughts and these ideals typically reproduce less often, and then if it is indeed due to like chemical imbalance, that chemical imbalance, which is inherited, is passed down less often.
I wouldn't go that deep into it. Just think about this. Like I'll say it's naturally selected for in this sense. Imagine there's two cavemen. They're walking through the woods, right? One cares about his well-being, the other doesn't. Right now, they're walking through the woods, and then a lion jumps out the bushes, roaring, and he was hungry. The one that cares about his well-being is going to run away. The one who doesn't is not going to care whether or not he gets eaten. He's not going to run. Yeah, and he's going to be the lion's supper.
Right. I just wanted to clarify, because I think sometimes that saying may come across as a little harsh or insensitive. And I don't think that was your intent. So I just wanted to clarify there.
Yeah, definitely. But what was the first? What was the
yeah? So getting back to it, essentially, you were talking about if the origins don't come from a deity, where are the origins of morality?
Oh yeah. So I was saying how it developed evolutionary, just like other human characteristics, and then we can see it started to mature over the years. Like, for instance, people who displayed antisocial behaviors, they tended to be isolated from groups, and they weren't able to reproduce and create more people that display antisocial behavior. Like these are your murderers, these are your rapists, right? That's why I would say we wouldn't have a lot of those people walking around. Even people talk about, the crime rate in certain areas are really high. And just think about this. Murder rate of about 20 and 100,000. That's really high. But that means you have 999,980, right? Yeah, that are not murderers. Right? So it's kind of a rare thing. The average human does care about their well-being, and like I said, it was naturally selected for, because especially as we started to civilize and develop societies and in governments, those are the people that were designing these functions, and it was built around people with that had those characteristics, those social characteristics, that respected boundaries, that cared about themselves and cared about each other.
Yeah, and so I would say that obviously that kind of falls into a clear line of logical reasoning, and I think there is a logical side of saying, like, morals are obviously subjective, at least to the point of everyone would agree to some extent that there are almost exceptions to be made to every rule, and that includes morality. So at some basic level, everyone's aware of the subjectivity of morality, whether they're willing to take it to the extent of all morality is subjective, or whether in this particular case we were willing to do something we would not normally do.
Mm-hmm.
Would you agree with that sentiment?
Yeah. I mean, I argue for situational ethics. So I wouldn't. There's very few things, if any, that I would say is always wrong. Yes, there's some things that I could say that's always wrong, but most actions I would say they're contextual. You have to consider the context. Like for example, we're talking about like lying. There are cases when it is definitely moral, considering the goal of preserving human well-being.
Right. Well, I think we should jump on into the next logical one, in my opinion, would be morality's impact on other worldviews, that being religion, philosophical stances, etc. Would you like to take on a philosophical stance or a religious one?
Give me the religious one. I'll take that.
All right. Well, I'll start then on a philosophical one, and one that I think it obviously plays a huge hand in, and that's utilitarianism. Mm-hmm. So utilitarianism in its most basic form says the greatest good for the greatest number of people. And that means that anything that can be said is better for some people, a larger group of people, is moral, because it is the right thing to do, because it is the greatest good for the greatest number. And the problem you have with things like utilitarianism is, like, you may have heard of, like, the trolley problem, where if there's one person on one side of the track and four people on the other, do you flip the switch to cause the trolley to go to the person with one? And then you just kind of keep making that scenario more and more ridiculous and more complicated. Like, what if you know the person? What if what if that person's a child? What if it's a pregnant woman? Like, you just keep making it more and more like specific or kind of evoking emotion as possible. To would you kill a pregnant woman and child, or would you kill these four people? And I think ultimately it's kind of gets into this level of silliness. I think we lost Geo. Just gonna continue on. Curious if I can add him back. But just kind of keeping on, like, the idea of utilitarianism, the main problem you're going to have in philosophy is that with utilitarianism, the greatest good for the greatest people could mean necessarily harming someone else. And what I mean by that is that if there is a person with a sickness that could potentially be contagious to everyone involved, then what could end up happening is you could say we should all kill this person. Let's say there's 100 people on an island. One person has the severe sickness that could contaminate everyone on the island. Could the 99 team up and kill the one person? Well, utilitarianism would say, yeah, it's probably better for the 99 people, but in a moral realist kind of standpoint, if you say the good is for the well-being of people, then in any situation in which you're forced to kill or harm another person, it's not morally justified. Gio, are you back?
I think some utilitarians would challenge you on that.
That it wasn't justified, or
well, that you should kill the one person and save the 99. Like some would definitely agree with you. Some might challenge you.
Well, I mean, if you take it at face value, that's where I say the very basic definition of utilitarianism is the greatest good for the greatest people. And if there's no, let's say hypothetically, this is obviously where hypotheticals, utilitarianism loves hypotheticals. The train trolley should be enough to concede that. But let's take the 100 people on the island hypothetical and say, if there is this island, then obviously there's no modern medicine. Therefore, there is no cure. And if you let this person continue to dwell amongst the 99, they will get infected and all of you will die. Like, that is the obvious end goal, like end game of what's going to happen with this infection. It's going to kill everyone if there aren't measures taken to effectively keep them from, going from, person to person and spreading this disease, virus, whatever you want to say it is. Doesn't really matter.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think there is a situation in which most utilitarianism, there might be a handful.
Depends. So there is some that would say that you're being myopic in your thinking, because they might look at the type of world that you're creating. If we're going to act by the pragmatic system of thought of killing a person just because they're sick, and just because they have a contagious deadly disease.
Yeah, but
think about
that's not
what happens if
the contingency is that if you don't, then everyone else will be infected. As long as this person lives, it will impact everyone else.
In this scenario, we know for sure, like we know we know the consequences that this is going to have on everyone else. That it is definitely going to kill everyone else. Yes, and we know that this is going to be a net benefit for everyone if you just kill this person.
Yep. So a true utilitarian, as far as I could tell, wouldn't be able to justify anything else.
So their issue wouldn't be ontologically, it'd be epistemic. And some might ask, how would you know that that's the consequences of it?
Because the point is it's a hypothetical, because and that's where I get to set up the rules and show you where you have a hole in your philosophy, because we can take things to the certainty of which certainty can be known, which is beyond a reasonable doubt. That's about it. We can't say anything is absolutely certain, but we can say, if you're going to play these rules, if you're going to claim these things, I get to set up a scenario, you have to abide by the rules of it. Because you could also say the same thing about the trolley system, where you have one person on one side of the track and 5 people on the other. Do you flip the switch? Well, what if a comet came and killed everyone in a 10-mile radius?
Well,
that's silly.
That's unlikely.
We're not saying it's not unlikely. Being on an island with one person and 100 others, and one person being somehow so ill and sick that they're going to kill 99 people is extremely unlikely. Yeah, but in this scenario, how are you being morally justified by doing what you're doing?
Because you have to consider the precedent that you're creating. If you're going to resort to killing someone every time that a person is sick with a contagious disease, and
in which it could wipe out the rest of humanity on this island, yes.
Yeah, and so that principle, because you're resorting to pragmatism, you may cause more harm than good. Because now that we know that if you get a contagious disease, a contagious fatal disease, that we're just going to kill you, right? Someone starts coughing. I mean, you don't know whether or not this disease is how quickly it spreads or how deadly it is. Maybe we should just, we've already decided that this is an option, that this is on the table. Why not go ahead and kill this person?
Right, but that's where the kind of setup doesn't justify the rules. You know what I'm saying? Like that's where, if you have this specific setup, if I get to make the scenario, I want you as a utilitarian to argue your side. And
but you have omniscience in this scenario.
Yeah, the point is, I'm making the scenario, therefore I know the outcome. Sure. Whereas if I'm saying there's this trolley problem, A, I'm unlikely to encounter a trolley, A, in existence ever. B, there's an infinitesimal amount of possibility that I'm going to actually come across a trolley in which there is a switch, and I can control that switch, and the trolley can't stop for some reason, and that there's someone on one side of the track and a group of people on the other side of the track, and for some reason, none of those people can escape this track. Mm-hmm. Like, there's a huge snowball of things that are silly about the problem in and of itself. I'm not saying the idea isn't silly in and of itself, or that, you know, whatever. I'm saying that if I get to set up the scenario, this is the scenario, not what if something else.
Yeah, I would say this, that your island scenario contains far more variables than the trolley scenario.
I mean, of course, not really.
Like, of course, I mean, likely scenarios. Right, because I mean, with the trolley, like, you kill the one person, cool, and now you have these 5 people, you can go up and you can let them go, and hey, that's it. On an island scenario, these people have to continue to live with each other, and they're going to rely on a precedent that they created from their decisions.
Not necessarily. I mean, you could even add the contingency that help will arrive in 2 weeks' time. But that person will infect everyone in set amount of time. Like, the reason time is important. Well, the reason time is important is the same reason time is important on the trolley scenario. Because if the trolley is 10 miles away, you don't really have to worry about the people on the track.
Well, yeah, I mean, assuming you have enough time to get them off. Yeah, I agree.
So time is really important when it comes to, like, this particular scenario, or any scenario where life seems in imminent danger. So in the situation on the island, if you stay in contact with this person more than, 24 hours, you're going to get infected and die within 48. Whereas that help will be there in a week, whatever.
I thought you meant maybe there was a civilization of 100 people on an island and then one got sick.
No. Obviously, in that situation, that's coming up from its own civilization and, like, defining rules of a future civilization. I'm talking about, what if a plane crashed and this was the scenario? Like, someone caught some deadly bacterial infection or whatever. I don't know. But
yeah, with utilitarianism, the ontology is the easy part. The hard part is epistemology, because that's when we're having to make judgment calls on the available information that we have, and there may be time restraints, and the information may be insufficient. So that's what I was pointing to. But sure, yeah, I totally get what you're saying now.
Yeah, and I mean, the obvious point there, the long and short of that whole scenario is that, can you ever morally justify a system of beliefs or a rationale, i.e. something like utilitarianism, in which it drives you to kill another person? Is there any scenario in which I can push a utilitarian into doing something they would otherwise say is morally apprehensible?
Yeah, definitely.
So if that is the case, and I think most utilitarians would say there is some crazy scenario I could come up with that would force you to say we would kill this person, then I might have, and I'd have to delve into my own personal beliefs, but I would say on face, I would have a problem with any philosophy that you could be pushed into such a scenario.
Yeah. I agree.
So what do you want to tackle next, or do you want to
getting short on time?
Yeah.
Let's get in that religion. I mean, it's okay. We'll go a few minutes afterwards, but I'm a few minutes over with the religion part. Because I know, and I personally know a lot of people who base their moral systems on essentially is divine command theory. So whatever God says, it's what's good, right?
So what God says is good.
Yeah, and whether it's coming directly through Him or a prophet or through a holy book, etc., it makes no difference to me. But essentially, it's divine command theory. Whatever God says is right, and the easy part is that you don't have to do any work. Right, you have God telling you exactly what is and isn't right, and people who resort to divine command theory, they not only create more problems, but they don't even conquer the hill that they had set their eyes on to begin with. For instance, let's say there's a God who says, murder is wrong, right? What's subjective about that? Isn't that just his opinion?
Well, so I think that would be contingent upon, like, if I'll play devil's advocate, or in this case, religion's advocate, and let's say I believe in a God that is omniscient. So God knows everything, and God says murder is wrong. Well, because he knows everything, he knows murder is wrong.
I wouldn't say moral has an ontology like other fields of study, like physics, right? Because when we talk about morals, we're talking about the way people ought to behave. So I'm not sure how omniscience would be helpful when we talk about objective moral values. Omniscience would be great for once you define the goal, what's the best way to get to that goal? Because now you have all of this data and you can make the best decision every time. But I'm asking about deciding what the goal ought to be. I don't see how omniscience gets you there. Like, I'm omniscient, murder is wrong. I don't see how omniscience makes that objective. That makes me a really smart guy with an opinion.
Well, if the God is not only omniscient but omnipotent, then well, you could say because he's omnipotent, or that God is omnipotent, whatever, that because they say it's wrong, it is wrong. Like it is
a really smart, strong guy with an opinion. A really strong, smart guy with an opinion.
Infinitely strong, smart guy
with an opinion. It doesn't make it objective.
Well, I mean, to an extent, but not really, because like if
might and knowledge is not about what objectivity is. This needs to be mind independent. It needs to exist without some opinion attributing value to it.
Because, well, so in the case of a deity, it's not an opinion attributing value. So I'll give you an example.
I'm mind attributing value to it. That's what I meant to say.
Well, let me kind of take that into the extent of something more personal and relatable, especially in your life, where I know you have a child. And let's say you tell this child you want it to do something, right? And then they do something else. Would you say they did what you told them to do wrong, or would you say what they did was wrong, or both?
I would say what they did was wrong. However, that's just shorthand. If I wanted to fully describe what happened, I would say, in respect relative to the instructions that I gave you, what you did was wrong because it was not conducive to achieving the goal that I had in mind. So when I say that is what you did was wrong, I'm not saying it's objective to the case. I'm just saying this is shorthand.
So what if this omniscient and omnipotent being just says murder is wrong because I say so, and because they are omnipotent and they literally have all the power, they get to make the rules. So it is objective in the sense that they're the objectifier.
I'd say nice opinion, bro. And just because you get to force it on me doesn't make it objective.
So in a sense where there is a real omnipotent and omniscient being who gives you a command, you would say that command is still not objective.
It is not objective. And that's irrelevant to the fact of whether or not I decide to follow it. In a sense, you could say that I'm sort of a god to my child, right? I'm way stronger than her. I know way more than her, right? And right, so I have a lot of power over her. But it doesn't make my instructions to her objectively right. It They're still subjective. There's no amount of power and there's no amount of knowledge that you could give to the person deciding the opinion to make it not an opinion, because those aren't the correct ingredients to make that. It's like as if you want to make a car a truck, right? And the way we're going to make this car a truck is we're going to throw blue paint on it. And you're like, is it a truck yet? No. All right, we got to keep throwing more blue and more blue paint on it. Like that's not the right ingredients. There's no amount of power. There's no amount of knowledge that could make it objective. This needs to be in order to be objective. It can't be based off a mind attributing value to it. That's subjectivity. Even if that mind is very powerful and very wise, it doesn't change the fact that it's subjective.
So, by your own definition, you would say that there's no way objectivity can be achieved with morality.
No. Well, what I'm saying that. Well, yeah, I on a moral goals, you can't reach the objectivity. It's the is-ought problem, and I'm saying with bringing a God into the equation, it definitely doesn't solve it. Because let's say there's the scenario where God says murder is wrong, right?
Mm-hmm.
And let's say I become a God, right? Okay. And like I take his spot.
Okay.
And he becomes immortal and I become God. And I say murder is now good.
Okay.
Obviously, is murder being good? Is that objectively true?
Well, I mean, obviously, in my opinion, I would say no.
Well, yeah. Well, if I could willy nilly change it.
Yeah, I mean, but like, just because it can be changed, but like, what about things that haven't been, or what about things that aren't necessarily changed? Like, for instance, like murder. There's not many civilizations throughout history, whether they believed in a deity or not, would say that murder is good.
Yeah, I mean, so these are moral intuitions that people have, and it's indicative of the evolutionary history of morality that I was describing. I don't believe is indicative of objectivity. If that's the argument you were trying to make.
No, I mean, just obviously playing religious advocate here is that if I were inclined to believe in an omnipotent, omniscient being, I would want to do what they said because they're omniscient. They know better than I do. So if true omniscience is obtained, then by them saying murder is wrong, since they know everything, Well, I mean, that would take into another account. Like, let's say I was incapable of lying, and I was omniscient and omnipotent. If I said murder is wrong, then it would inherently be objectively true.
No,
Yes.
it wouldn't.
It
Because
would, because I'm
it's just
incapable of lying.
it's your omniscient mind, your very powerful mind attributing value to it. But it's not objectively the case.
Well,
This
it's
is just something
objectively
that you
true.
value.
It's objectively true because I'm incapable of lying.
No. So I don't. I'm not following. So you're saying you're incapable of lying, and so you say
I'm also
morality is
I
wrong.
know everything. I'm omniscient and I'm omnipotent for whatever reason, even though it's not necessary in this particular case.
So I in this scenario, I think you're begging the question because so what? Tell me. So if you're saying he's omniscient, right, and so he knows that morality is, I'm sorry, he knows that murder is objectively wrong. Right? That is the very question that we're struggling with. In your scenario, you already know that it's wrong.
Well, as an
Sure.
omniscient being, I would know everything.
Yeah, exactly. So, but in your scenario, murder is already objectively wrong because you know it to be. And what I'm saying is, how does it become objective? And that's what we're deciding on.
So obviously,
If someone was truly omniscient, and then they said, if someone was truly omniscient, and then they said, murder is objectively wrong.
Okay.
Right? And they're saying this isn't because that they've abhor more murder, but it is like somehow woven into the fabric of the universe that it is that way. And sure, but we're begging a question. Because in this scenario,
yeah, I mean,
it's
just kind of
already
leading back
wrong.
to the origins of morality. Like, where would it come from? Well, so what you're saying is the argument for a deity still leads to subjectivity.
Definitely, that's all that it is. It's definitely subjective, and to as evidence of this, I mean, you can just look out throughout the years where even the opinions of the church on morality has evolved over the years. It seems to just be a few steps behind humanists, in my opinion. But like, I mean, if you're familiar with Saint Augustine, right?
Saint Augustine of Assisi.
Yeah, you should see some of the stuff that he says about slavery. I mean, the man is just a moral monster. And he pulls it straight from his, Exodus 22 and Deuteronomy 24. And I mean, it makes sense for him to say that. But now you look at the vast majority of Christians, they'll acknowledge that slavery is wrong.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you ask most modern
the church's opinion
humans
on morals has evolved over the years.
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely agree with that. That most modern people would say slavery is wrong, but in and of itself, the reason why they say it was wrong might be different than why you and I would say it's wrong, which is kind of where we were touching on earlier.
Yeah, and this is we should save the slavery thing for another podcast, but I just referenced how the morality of religious institutions, especially Christianity, has just evolved over the past 2,000 years. And so, to me, that is great evidence against the belief that they have some sort of objective moral system.
I would agree, at least in relation to Christianity. And we could get further into that and down that rabbit hole at some point in the future. But if you have the time, maybe take like 5-ish minutes and just talk about the ramifications of it all. And I'm going to flip over to our thanks for watching while we wrap up.
Yeah. So why should you care about morality?
Yeah, well, I mean, like, essentially, what does it matter?
Yeah, well, I suppose in a billion years or 10 billion years after the sun burns out and all of civilization is dead, it won't matter. But if you care about yourself right now, then you should care. If you care about the world that you live in, if you have any children, if you care about the world that they're going to grow up in, they're going to inherit, if you care about reducing suffering, then that's something you ought to care about.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, I wanted to even take it and take another giant step backwards in that same thing, as far as the ramifications of morality and its origins and pretty much everything that we talked about, and an infinite number of things that we didn't talk about, because you could talk for hours and hours about morality. But
yeah,
the ramifications of morality, about what's right and wrong in the world as we perceive it, is that at minimum, I think the you scratch my back, I scratch yours, eye for an eye, golden rule, whatever you want to call this, is at its core a relatively good dictum of morality. And the ramifications of having a deity that applies your morality versus not having a deity, I think you kind of summed it up best by saying all it does is it places the burden of morality's origins on a deity instead of something else that we don't necessarily have or can't point to. So with that in mind, the ramifications of morality and how it impacts everybody and how it impacts religion and philosophy and even, things as mundane as a single person, is that it's something that everyone considers and everyone takes on at some point, whether something is right or wrong. Every culture throughout history, every single person, every religion, every philosophy, every idealist, everyone who is capable of rational thought says, is there something right or wrong to this, and why? And I think that basically just stumbles back to humans' ability to think rationally. And I think that is the only thing that separates when a human kills another human with malice and intent as a murder to when a lioness kills a gazelle as survival. Like, it's not... Most people would say that when a lioness kills a gazelle, it's not murder. But yet humans have our own viewpoint of looking at when a human kills another human. We even have our own specific word for it. I don't think I've ever read a science textbook or never seen a YouTube video or BBC documentary on animals in which it says the lioness murdered the gazelle. Like, it just doesn't happen. And I think the reason for that being is because humans are capable of reflective thought. And so we can look back upon our actions and see how they impact A, other humans, B, the culture that you currently live in, and or the society you live in, as well as a potential greater impact upon the world itself. So for things like nuclear war, we could even proactively think about what nuclear war would do to the planet, which is something that no other species on the planet is capable of. So that's kind of what I wanted to take a step back on, at least kind of give my 2 cents there. I'm not sure if you even agree with that, but just something I've been considering as far as morality and why humans have morality. And that's essentially because we're capable of reflective thought. Full stop.
Yeah, I don't think we have time to uh, discuss it further. But I'd like to push back on a few points, but we're short on time.
Yeah, fair enough. We can always kind of rehash the subject in the future. In the meantime, I think we're just going to wrap it up here. Want to thank everyone that watched and everyone that's currently watching. Jeremy, thanks for jumping in chat. If anyone does watch in the future, please feel free to give us a chat, give us a comment on YouTube, ask us questions, send us an email, call the number when we're live. We want to hear from you. We want to hear, let your voice be heard. That's kind of our little tagline here at Now That's Debatable, is let your voice be heard. And the reason that Gio and I set up this platform, and the reason that we want it to go in a certain way, is to let everyone that watches and everyone that potentially watches break down these things at a level that everyone, basically everyone can understand, but also everyone can have their own say and kind of express their own opinion, which is why we have the call-in option and why we have the chat up on screen the entire time, and why we have these Q&A sessions, and we're going to get guest callers in. Unfortunately, we didn't get Panda in today. I'll chat with him, see what was going on, see if we can get him on the next one. But anything you wanted to add to that, Gio?
No, not much. Just if you tune in, I hope you enjoyed. Next time, please call in, chat. We really want to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to wrap it up here, and we'll see you next time on Now That's Debatable.